You two, get up. Out of the booth. Now. The voice was the first thing. Not loud, not shouting. It was worse than that. It was casual. The kind of casual authority that expects unquestioning obedience. The kind that has never been seriously challenged. It sliced through the low murmur of the Bluebird Diner, through the clatter of cutlery on ceramic and the sizzle of bacon on the flat-top grill. Detective Marcus Thorne did not move. He kept his eyes on the cup of coffee cradled in his hands. Steam rose from the thick, white mug, disappearing into the cool, recycled air of the diner. Beside him, he could feel the sudden tension in Detective Jamal Hayes, a subtle shift in weight on the worn red vinyl of the booth. Phones were rising. Not all of them. Just a few, held low, their small, dark lenses like the unblinking eyes of wary animals. The air in the diner had changed. The low hum of conversations had fallen away, leaving only the kitchen sounds and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus stood calm, a man carved from patience, his stillness a stark contrast to the aggressive energy radiating from the officer standing over their table. What the officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend in his bubble of swagger and uniform, was that the two men he was ordering out of a diner booth were the very instruments of the city's conscience. He didn't know that every word he spoke, every micro-expression of contempt, was being captured on a high-fidelity digital wire, its signal beaming silently to a secure server miles away. He didn't know he wasn't just losing his temper, he was ending his career. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The morning had begun with light, a specific quality of light, the kind that only comes in the first week of October in the city, when the air has a new crispness to it and the sun has to fight its way through a thin veil of haze. It slanted through the blinds of Marcus Thorne's bedroom, striping the hardwood floor in patterns of gold and shadow. He had been awake for 20 minutes, lying perfectly still, listening to the quiet, even breathing of his wife Lena beside him. He did this every morning. It was a ritual, a grounding, a reminder of the world he fought to protect, the peace he worked to preserve. He was 54 years old, a detective with 28 years on the force, and he had exactly 213 days until his retirement. He counted them every morning, not with anticipation, with a sense of duty. A countdown to a finish line he was determined to cross with his integrity intact. He slipped out of bed, his movements slow and deliberate, a habit learned over decades of not wanting to wake a sleeping partner or a child startled by a nightmare. In the kitchen, the smell of coffee beans, dark and rich, filled the air as the grinder did its work. Another ritual. The grinding, the brewing, the first sip in the quiet of his own home. This was his armor, this normalcy. He stood by the window, looking out at the waking neighborhood. Brick houses, neat lawns, still green from the late summer rains, a string of Halloween decorations already appearing on a neighbor's porch. He saw Mrs. Gable next door retrieving her newspaper. Giving him a small wave, he returned with a nod. This was his community, the place he had been born, the place he had raised his daughter, the place he intended to die. He had learned a long time ago that you don't fight for a city, an abstract concept. You fight for a street, a block, a neighbor waving from her front porch. His phone buzzed on the granite countertop, a single, short vibration. The agreed-upon signal. Jamal. Marcus took another slow sip of his coffee. He let himself feel the warmth of the mug, the familiar bitterness of the brew, for exactly 10 more seconds. Then he rinsed the mug, placed it in the dishwasher, and went to get dressed. He chose his clothes with care, not a suit, nothing that screamed cop. Faded blue jeans, a gray long-sleeved thermal shirt, and a well-worn canvas jacket. The kind of clothes that would make him invisible. A man of a certain age having a late breakfast. Anonymous. That was the goal. He kissed Lena's forehead before he left. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Marcus? Go back to sleep, he whispered. Just work. She squeezed his hand. Be careful. Always. The word was a promise he had made thousands of times. The drive to the rendezvous point was quiet. Just the road and the engine and the morning air. He didn't listen to the radio. He preferred the silence. It allowed him to think, to assemble the pieces of the day ahead. The operation was codenamed Bluebird, after the diner that was his focus. For 6 months, the Internal Affairs Division had been receiving a trickle of anonymous complaints, all from the same precinct, all involving the same two officers, Miller and Davis. The complaints spoke of harassment, illegal stops, and intimidation, disproportionately targeting black and brown residents, but they were all anecdotal, one person's word against an officer's. The machine was designed to handle that. It chewed up such complaints and spat them out as unfounded. The system worked exactly as it was designed to, exhausting people until they gave up. So our AD had decided on a different approach. A proactive one. They would not wait for another complaint. They would become the complaint. Jamal Hayes was waiting for him in the unmarked sedan parked 2 blocks from the diner. Jamal was younger, 32, with a sharp mind and an energy that Marcus found both exhausting and invigorating. He was a good detective, disciplined, but Marcus could see the fire in him, the righteous anger that he himself had learned to bank and control decades ago. "Morning, old man," Jamal said, a grin on his face. "Keep calling me that and you'll be buying," Marcus replied, settling into the passenger seat. "Deal." Jamal handed him a small flat device, the wire. "Audio is hot. Video is a button cam on the jacket. Same for me. Everything is feeding live to the van. They're parked 4 blocks over. We give them the distress word, check, and they send in the cavalry. Anything else, we play it by ear." Marcus threaded the slim wire under his shirt, attaching the microphone with a small piece of medical tape to his sternum. He checked the button camera on his jacket, a tiny, almost invisible lens. He felt the familiar weight of the equipment, the slight constriction. It was a second skin he had worn many times. "You eat?" Marcus asked. "Nah. Waiting for that famous bluebird omelet I've heard so much about." "George makes a good omelet," Marcus said. He knew the owner. George Patterson had been running the Bluebird Diner for 40 years. He'd seen the neighborhood change, seen generations of kids grow up. He'd also seen decades of policing, the good and the bad. George was one of the reasons Marcus had pushed for this operation. He'd heard the weariness in the old man's voice the last time he'd stopped in for coffee off duty. The kind of weariness that comes from seeing the same story play out too many times. "All right," Jamal said, his voice now all business. "Let's go to breakfast." They walked the 2 blocks to the diner. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows down the street. The Bluebird Diner sat on a corner, a classic mid-century structure of stainless steel and large plate glass windows. A simple blue neon bird, unlit in the daylight, hung over the door. Inside, the diner was about half full, a mix of working folks grabbing a quick meal, a few students from the nearby community college, and a couple of elderly women sharing a pot of tea. The smell of coffee and frying potatoes was thick in the air. That was the first thing they noticed. The smell. It was a smell of normalcy, of community. It was the smell of a place that had served thousands of breakfasts, witnessed thousands of conversations. George was behind the counter, a tall, lean man in his late 60s with a kind face etched with the lines of a long life. He saw Marcus and a flicker of recognition crossed his features, a subtle tightening around his eyes. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Marcus nodded back. No words were needed. George knew. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew Marcus was police, and he knew Marcus wasn't here just for an omelet. A waitress with a tired smile and a full coffee pot gestured them toward an empty booth by the window. The red vinyl was cracked in a few places, testament to its long service. They slid in, the springs groaning in protest. Marcus sat facing the door. "Another habit?" "Coffee, fellas?" the waitress asked. "2, please," Jamal said. She poured the coffee, dark and steaming, into the thick white mugs. It was the same mug from Marcus's kitchen. The thought gave him a strange sense of comfort, a thread of continuity between his 2 worlds. They ordered. A Western omelet for Jamal, scrambled eggs and rye toast for Marcus. Simple. Normal. For 15 minutes they sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee. They were 2 men having breakfast. They watched the life of the diner unfold. The short order cook, a master of his craft, flipping pancakes with a flick of his wrist. George sharing a quiet word with a regular at the counter. The teenage girl in the corner booth, furiously texting on her phone, a half-eaten stack of waffles forgotten in front of her. It was a portrait of a neighborhood at peace. Then the bell over the door chimed, and the peace was broken. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, Miller and Davis. Marcus knew them from their files. Miller was tall and broad, with a military-style haircut and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He carried himself with a swagger that bordered on aggression. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered sidearm as he scanned the room. Behavioral signature, hand on holster before speaking. Davis was shorter, younger, with a nervous energy. He followed Miller's lead, his eyes darting around, mirroring his partner's posture. They weren't responding to a call. They were on patrol. This was a routine stop for them, a chance to grab a free coffee and assert their presence. They didn't speak to George. They walked past the counter and their eyes swept the room. Marcus felt the shift in atmosphere instantly. Conversations quieted. People hunched over their food a little more. The officer's gaze passed over the white patrons without pause. It lingered on a table of two Latino construction workers, then moved on. Then it found Marcus and Jamal, and it stopped. Marcus didn't look up, but he could feel the weight of their stare. It was a physical pressure. He continued to sip his coffee. Beside him, Jamal had gone still. Miller and Davis exchanged a look, a silent, ugly communication. Then Miller started walking toward their booth. Each step was heavy, deliberate, a performance. He was walking for the benefit of the room, to show who was in charge. He stopped at their table, looming over them. Davis stood a few feet back, his hand now also resting near his weapon. "You two?" Miller said. His voice was flat, devoid of any courtesy. "What are you doing here?" Jamal started to speak, but Marcus put a hand on his arm, a barely there pressure. "Let me." Marcus looked up, meeting Miller's gaze. He kept his expression neutral. "Having breakfast, officer." Miller's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile, a smirk. "This is a nice, quiet place. We like to keep it that way." That wasn't a statement. That was a message. "You don't belong here." "We're just having a quiet breakfast," Marcus repeated calmly. His heart rate was steady. He had practiced this emotional discipline for years. He was an observer now, a collector of data. The anger was there, a cold, dense knot in his stomach, but it was walled off, contained. "I don't think so," Miller said. He gestured with his thumb toward the door. "You two, get up, out of the booth, now." The waitress, who had been approaching with their food, froze mid-step, plates in hand. George, from behind the counter, took a half step forward, his face a mask of weary anger. The teenage girl in the corner booth, Maya, had lowered her phone, but Marcus saw her finger move, her thumb swiping to the camera app. The small red light of a recording began to blink, almost invisibly from her table. The food arrived just as the command was given. The waitress, a woman named Sarah who had worked here for 12 years, hesitated, the plates trembling slightly in her hands. She looked from the officers to Marcus and Jamal, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. "Just put the food down, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice gentle. He wanted her out of the line of fire. She placed the plates on the table, the Western omelet fluffy and filled with peppers and ham, the scrambled eggs and rye toast. The smell of hot food, a symbol of normalcy, was now part of a scene that was anything but. Miller glared at the waitress. "Beat it." She scurried away, back toward the safety of the kitchen. "I gave you an order," Miller said, his voice dropping lower, becoming more menacing. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on their table, invading their space, physically crowding the protagonist's space, a classic intimidation tactic. "Are you deaf?" Jamal's jaw was tight. Marcus could feel the coiled energy coming off him. He was ready to spring, ready to identify themselves and end this farce. But that wasn't the protocol. The protocol was to absorb, to document the full extent of the violation. "Officer, we are paying customers in a public establishment," Marcus stated, his tone measured, almost academic. "We haven't done anything wrong." "You exist. That's what you've done wrong," Miller sneered. It was a quiet sneer, not for the whole room, but for them. A little gem of pure, unadulterated bigotry he was offering up for their recording. "We'd like to eat our breakfast," Jamal said, his voice hard as stone. "You can eat it on the sidewalk," Miller retorted. He straightened up. "I'm not going to tell you again. Get up." The silence that followed lasted about 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, Marcus cataloged everything. The way Davis shifted his weight from foot to foot, a sign of nervousness. The way George was now polishing the same spot on the counter over and over, his knuckles white. The way the two construction workers were staring intently at their plates, trying to become invisible, and the small, steady red light from Maya's phone. The witness. Marcus made a decision. They had enough. They had the unprovoked command, the justification, the clear bias. It was time to comply physically while asserting their rights verbally. This was the next phase of the test. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus placed his hands on the table where Miller could see them. "We are complying under duress," he said, his voice clear and loud enough for the wire to pick up perfectly. He slid out of the booth, his movements unhurried. Jamal followed his lead, his face a mask of cold fury. "On your feet. Let's go," Miller commanded, gesturing them toward the door. He walked behind them, far too close, his presence a constant, aggressive pressure at their backs. Davis flanked them, creating a corridor of blue uniforms. As they walked past the counter, Marcus caught George's eye. The old man's face was full of a pain that was deeper than this one incident. It was the pain of a lifetime of such moments. The elder. Marcus gave him the slightest of nods, a message that he hoped conveyed what he couldn't say. "This time is different. I promise." They were escorted out of the diner like criminals. The bell above the door chimed their exit. The morning air, which had felt crisp and clean just 20 minutes earlier, now felt heavy and hostile. The sunlight seemed harsh, glinting off the chrome of a passing car. They were on the sidewalk now, in full view of the street. Miller and Davis herded them against the plate glass window of the diner. Inside, Marcus could see the faces of the other patrons watching. Humiliation was part of the tactic. It was meant to break you down, to make you feel less than human. "Hands on the glass. Spread 'em," Miller barked. "On what grounds, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice still steady. He knew the answer. There were no grounds. This was the critical legal juncture. "On the grounds that I said so," Miller shot back. "You want to add resisting to the charges?" "What charges?" Jamal asked, his voice dangerously low. "I'll think of something. Disorderly conduct, loitering, trespassing." Miller smirked. "Now, hands on the glass before I help you." Marcus felt the rage again, hot and sharp. He let himself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he converted it into fuel. He slowly placed his hands on the cool glass of the window. He could see his own reflection. A man in a canvas jacket with his hands spread, a caricature of a suspect. Beside him, Jamal did the same. The pat-down was rough, unprofessional. It wasn't a search for weapons. It was an act of dominance. Miller's hands ran over Marcus's body, pressing, slapping. He felt Miller's hand linger on the small, hard outline of his wallet in his back pocket. "What do we have here?" Miller said, pulling the wallet out. He flipped it open. He saw the driver's license, the credit cards, and then he saw the badge, the gold-plated detective shield, nestled in its leather holder. The silence was immediate and profound. Miller froze. His hands, which had been so aggressive just a moment before, now seemed paralyzed. He stared at the shield, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Davis, noticing the silence, had moved to pat down Jamal. He found Jamal's shield at the same moment. Bill," Davis whispered, his voice cracking. Miller didn't respond. He just stared at the shield in his hand, then up at Marcus's face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not understanding, not remorse. It was fear. The animal fear of a predator who has just realized it attacked a much more dangerous animal. But fear quickly curdled back into aggression. It was the only way he knew how to react. "This is fake," Miller blurted out, his voice too loud. "You're impersonating an officer. That's a felony." He was trying to regain control of the narrative, to reshape reality to fit his worldview. "Run the shield number, Officer Miller," Marcus said. His voice was cold iron. "My name is Detective Marcus Thorne, Internal Affairs Division. The man next to me is Detective Jamal Hayes, and you are the subject of an official investigation." Jamal turned his head, a grim smile finally touching his lips. "And you have the right to remain silent." Miller's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. He looked from the shield to Marcus to Davis to the diner window full of faces. He was trapped. The performative authority had crumbled, leaving only the cowardice beneath. "You can't. This is entrapment," he stammered, waving the shield. "Entrapment is inducing someone to commit a crime they otherwise wouldn't commit," Marcus stated, his voice a lesson in law. "We merely provided you with the opportunity to conduct yourself professionally. You chose another path. Every word of this interaction, Officer Miller, has been recorded." At the mention of recording, Miller's eyes darted wildly. He saw the small lens on Marcus's jacket for the first time. His face fell. The bravado, the contempt, the certainty, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving a hollowed-out man in a uniform. Just then, a patrol car screeched to a halt beside them. A sergeant got out, a man with a thick neck and a perpetually annoyed expression. Sergeant Lynch, the mid-level protector. He was Miller and Davis's direct supervisor. "What the hell is going on here, Miller?" Lynch demanded, his eyes taking in the scene. Two cops, two black men against a wall. To him, this was a normal Tuesday morning scene. "Sarge," Miller began, his voice desperate, "these guys, they're claiming to be IAD." Lynch's eyes narrowed. He strode over to Marcus. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look at Marcus as a fellow officer. He looked at him as a problem. "Let me see your identification," Lynch said. "Not a request. An order." Marcus nodded to Miller, who numbly handed the wallet and shield to his sergeant. Lynch examined it, his thumb rubbing over the gold surface as if testing its authenticity. He looked at the ID card. He looked back at Marcus. "My office is going to have a field day with this," Lynch said. He wasn't talking to Marcus. He was talking to Miller and Davis, reassuring them. "I'll handle this. I'll make this go away. An illegal internal sting. No oversight. You two," he said, pointing a thick finger at Marcus and Jamal, "are in a world of trouble." He was building the wall, the blue wall, right there on the sidewalk. "Sergeant," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone he reserved for moments of extreme gravity. "I want you to think very carefully about your next words. We are conducting a Class A investigation under the authority of the Deputy Commissioner. The devices you are about to try and illegally confiscate are transmitting a live feed, and our backup, which consists not of 2 patrol officers but of a full IAD tactical team, is 3 blocks away and will be here in approximately 90 seconds. He glanced at his watch. "No, make that 80. The countdown had begun. Lynch's face, which had been a mask of confident authority, flickered. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered his eyes. He had built his career on bluster and intimidation, on the assumption that the system would always protect its own. He was staring at 2 men who represented a crack in that foundation. He looked from Marcus's calm, unyielding face to Jamal's simmering anger, then back to his own officers, who now looked like frightened children. The machine was supposed to protect them, but the machine was now turning on them. "You're bluffing," Lynch said, but the words lacked conviction. "Am I?" Marcus replied. He didn't need to say anything else. The truth had its own weight, and right on cue, 2 dark blue vans and an unmarked sedan turned the corner at speed, their tires chirping as they pulled to the curb. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need to. Their sudden, silent arrival was far more intimidating. Doors slid open and men in tactical vests with IAD stenciled in bold white letters emerged. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that made Miller and Davis look like amateurs. The lead investigator, a stern-faced lieutenant named Diaz, approached the group. He completely ignored Miller, Davis, and Lynch. His focus was solely on his detectives. "Detective Thorne, Detective Hayes, are you unharmed?" "We're fine, Lieutenant," Marcus said, finally taking his hands off the glass. Lynch stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. The world had just turned upside down. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. He was no longer the ranking officer on the scene. He was now a person of interest. "Sergeant Lynch," Diaz said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I'm going to need you and your officers to secure your weapons and surrender your communication devices. You'll be escorted to headquarters for a formal interview." "You can't be serious," Lynch sputtered. "This is a misunderstanding. Your men were recorded committing multiple policy violations and potential criminal acts." Diaz cut him off. "What you say from this moment forward can and will be used against you. Don't make it worse." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. The same words, the same threats they used on a daily basis were now being turned back on them. Miller and Davis were disarmed with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. They were not handcuffed. Not yet. That would come later. For now, they were simply neutralized, their authority stripped away in front of the same audience they had tried to intimidate. Inside the diner, every face was pressed to the glass. George stood at the door, his arms crossed, watching. Maya, the teenager, had her phone up openly now, recording the entire scene, her face a mixture of shock and something that looked like vindication. Marcus walked over to her. "Young lady," he said gently. She flinched, expecting to be told to stop recording. "My name is Detective Thorne," he continued. "Thank you for what you did. That footage is now evidence. I need you to do me a favor. Don't post it online. Not yet. Hold on to it. A lawyer from the city will be in contact with you and your parents. Can you do that for me? Can you trust the process?" Maya looked at him, at his kind eyes, at the quiet authority that had nothing to do with a uniform or a weapon. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Thank you," Marcus said. He meant it. She was a part of this now, an essential part. The ride back to the 1st Precinct headquarters was a study in contrast. Marcus and Jamal rode in the quiet, air-conditioned comfort of the IAD sedan. Miller, Davis, and Lynch were placed in the back of one of the vans, the cage separating them from the tactical officers who sat in stony silence. The radios were quiet. The tension was palpable. Marcus watched the city slide by, the familiar streets and buildings. It was the same city, but something had fundamentally changed in the last hour. A lever had been pulled. A gear in the great grinding machine of the department had been jammed. The precinct house was buzzing. Word had traveled fast. As Marcus and Jamal walked through the main doors, conversation stopped. Heads turned. They were met with a mixture of expressions, curiosity, resentment, and, from a few older black officers, a look of quiet, profound respect. This was a line that had rarely been crossed. IAD was usually a reactive force, cleaning up messes. This was different. This was a direct challenge to the precinct's culture. They were led not to the IAD section, but to a conference room on the 3rd floor reserved for high-level meetings. The Deputy Commissioner of Investigations, a man named Peterson, was waiting for them. He was a career cop who had transitioned into a political role, and his face was etched with worry. "Thorne, Hayes," he said, forgoing any pleasantries, "walk me through it. From the top." For the next hour, they did just that. Marcus spoke, his voice calm and factual, while Jamal interjected with specific quotes and timestamps, his memory for detail photographic. They laid out the entire incident, from the moment they walked into the diner to the moment Diaz's team arrived. They didn't editorialize. They didn't speak of the humiliation or the anger. They presented facts. The wire recordings were already being transcribed. The video was being logged into evidence. When they finished, Peterson was silent for a long time. He stared out the window at the cityscape. "Lynch has been on the force for 20 years, he said, almost to himself. "Miller is a Marine vet. Davis's father was a captain." He was reciting their bona fides, building the case for leniency in his own mind. He was weighing the political cost. "They are also liabilities," Marcus said quietly. "They are a lawsuit waiting to happen. Today it was 2 detectives. Tomorrow it could be a civilian with a cell phone camera and a good lawyer. Or worse, it could be a civilian who panics and one of those officers gets scared, and we're leading the 6 o'clock news for all the wrong reasons." "Lynch is already screaming about an illegal sting," Peterson said, turning back to them. "He's claiming you targeted his men without cause." "The cause is a file 2 inches thick in our office, sir," Jamal said, his voice sharp. 16 informal complaints in the last year against those 2 officers alone. All of them closed as unfounded by Sergeant Lynch. Peterson sighed. He ran a hand over his tired face. He was a man caught in the gears of the machine. He wanted to do the right thing, but he was also terrified of breaking the machine itself. "The union is already calling me. The PBA president is on his way down here. This is going to get messy." "It was already messy, sir," Marcus said. "It was just messy for the people living in that neighborhood. Now it's messy for us, where it belongs." The deputy commissioner looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the 28 years of service in the lines around his eyes. He saw the unshakable conviction. "I'm putting them on desk duty pending a full investigation," Peterson decided. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not enough," Jamal protested. "They need to be suspended. Their weapons and shields should be held. I can't do that, Peterson said, shaking his head. Not yet. The union would crucify me. Desk duty is the best I can do. We'll let the investigation play out. We'll follow the process. The process. Marcus had heard that phrase 1,000 times. It was often a euphemism for let this die a quiet death in a mountain of paperwork. He felt a familiar wave of disappointment. They had risked their careers, their safety. They had delivered pristine, irrefutable evidence of misconduct and bigotry. And the system's first reflex was still to protect itself. To minimize, to contain. They were dismissed. As they walked out of the conference room, they saw Miller, Davis, and Lynch being led into another room by a pair of union delegates. Lynch caught Marcus's eye. He wasn't scared anymore. He was defiant. His expression was clear. You think you won? This is my house. You can't touch me. That night, Marcus sat in his kitchen. The house was quiet. Lena was asleep. He had a glass of water in his hands, the condensation cool against his fingers. He had told Lena a sanitized version of the day's events, enough to explain his exhaustion, but not enough to cause her fear. He replayed the day in his mind, the look on George's face, the red light on Maya's phone, the smirk on Miller's face, the defiance in Lynch's eyes. He felt the anger, the deep, bone-weary rage at the injustice of it all. The system was pushing back. The machine was trying to repair itself, to expel the foreign object that was trying to jam its gears. He let himself feel it all, the humiliation, the frustration, the anger. He didn't set a timer this time. He just let it wash over him, a cold, dark tide. He knew this was the most dangerous moment. This was where most investigations died. The initial burst of action would fade, and the long, slow grind of institutional inertia would begin. Lynch and his men would be back on the street in a month, maybe with a letter in their file, and the people in the Bluebird Diners neighborhood would learn, once again, that nothing ever really changes. But then he thought of George's face again, and the promise he had made with a silent nod. He stood up and walked to his small home office. He turned on his computer. The initial report was done, filed electronically, but that wasn't enough. The departmental process was compromised. Peterson was too political, too afraid. If they wanted real justice, they couldn't rely on the machine to police itself. They had to go around it. He pulled up a secure, encrypted email client. He began to type. His contact was a woman named Alana Reed. She was an assistant United States attorney in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He had worked a case with her 5 years prior, a complex investigation into corruption at a federal prison. She was brilliant, relentless, and utterly unimpressed by badges and titles. She cared about one thing, the law. The subject line was simple: pattern and practice. In the body of the email, he wrote a brief factual summary of the day's events. He attached the preliminary transcript of the audio recording. He ended the email with a single sentence: "This is the tip of the iceberg." He hit send. The email disappeared into the digital ether, a quiet declaration of war against the system he had served his entire life. He knew the consequences. He was breaking chain of command. He was inviting the full weight of the federal government into his department's business. If this failed, his career would be over, not with a quiet retirement, but with a dishonorable discharge. He shut down the computer and went back to the kitchen. The first rays of the morning sun were just beginning to touch the horizon. A new day. He had 192 days of his countdown remaining. He had a feeling they were going to be the longest days of his life. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in institutional stonewalling. Miller and Davis remained on desk duty, a paid vacation at the precinct, where they were treated as heroes by their colleagues. Sergeant Lynch was not disciplined at all. He was reassigned to supervise the evidence locker, a move that was framed as administrative but was clearly a temporary measure to keep him out of the spotlight. The official IAD investigation, now headed by a lieutenant known for his loyalty to the Union, moved at a glacial pace. Key witnesses were not interviewed. Logbooks went missing. The momentum was gone, deliberately bled out by 1,000 tiny bureaucratic cuts. Jamal was vibrating with frustration. "They're burying it, Marcus," he said, pacing their small IAD office. "They're burying it right in front of us. Peterson won't even take my calls anymore." "Patience," Marcus counseled, though his own was wearing thin. He was staring at a photo on his desk, It was of him and his father, taken the day he graduated from the police academy. His father, a bus driver for 40 years, had a proud but worried look on his face. He had warned Marcus that the uniform was heavy, that it carried the weight of both trust and suspicion. He had learned that lesson every day for 28 years. Patience for what? Jamal shot back. For Lynch to get a promotion? For Miller and Davis to get commendations for bravery in the face of provocation? Patience for the seeds to sprout, Marcus said, turning away from the photo. His encrypted email had been answered 12 hours after he sent it. A single line from AUSA Alana Reed. I'm listening. Send me everything. For the next week, Marcus and Jamal worked in secret. After their official shifts, they met in a small, windowless room in the federal courthouse, a space Reed had secured for them. They were building a second case, a shadow investigation hidden from their own department. They brought Reed the full, unredacted file of the 16 prior complaints against Miller and Davis. They brought her the personnel files, showing a pattern of escalating aggression and Lynch's signature on every performance review, signing off on their conduct. But Reed knew, and Marcus knew, that it wasn't enough. To bring a federal case, they needed to show more than just one bad day and a history of complaints. They needed to show a culture, a conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. They needed to connect the frontline antagonist to the systemic enabler. We need to go back to the diner, Marcus said one evening as they sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal conference room. The answer is there. The next morning, Marcus drove to the Bluebird Diner. He was off duty, wearing the same anonymous clothes as before. The diner was quiet. When he walked in, George looked up from the counter. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked over, his face grim. "Detective," he said, his voice low. "Haven't seen you." "Been busy, George," Marcus said. "Can we talk?" George led him to a small, cluttered office in the back, a room that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. He closed the door. "They're trying to bury it, aren't they?" George asked. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He had seen this story before. "They're trying," Marcus admitted. "I'm not going to let them." He leaned forward. "George, the complaints we have on file, they're all anonymous. We need people to go on the record. We need to show this wasn't just Miller and Davis. This is a pattern." George was silent for a long moment. He looked at Marcus, his gaze searching. He was deciding whether this time was truly different, whether this man was worth the risk. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. He walked over to a large, dusty filing cabinet in the corner, a relic from the 1970s. He fumbled with a key, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a simple brown cardboard box. He placed it on the desk between them, the box of evidence. "I started this after my son was roughed up by a couple of cops about 15 years ago," George said, his voice thick with memory. "Nothing came of it, of course, so I started writing things down. Every time I saw something. Every time a customer came in here, shaken, telling me they'd been pulled over and harassed for no reason right outside." He opened the box. It was filled with small, spiral-bound notebooks, dozens of them. Each one was filled with George's neat, precise handwriting, dates, times, badge numbers when he could get them, descriptions of incidents, names of victims who had told him their stories in confidence. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking archive of casual cruelty. "I have Miller and Davis in here 32 times over the past 2 years," George said, tapping one of the notebooks. "But I also have Lynch. He used to be a patrolman on this beat. I have him in here from 10 years ago, doing the same things. This isn't about two bad apples, detective. The whole barrel is rotten." Marcus stared at the box. This was it. This was the foundation. This was the history that the official records had erased. It was the collective memory of a community that had refused to forget. "George," Marcus said, his voice filled with a respect that bordered on awe, "you have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," George replied. "I've been waiting for someone to come along who would actually listen." The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. The insider, a young dispatcher named Maria Flores, reached out to Jamal. She had seen him in the precinct, seen the way the other cops treated him after the incident. She was terrified, but she was more tired than she was scared. She was tired of hearing the racism over the radio, the casual jokes about thugs and animals. She was tired of seeing Sergeant Lynch call in to clear a call log after one of his favorite officers had a contentious stop. She had been making her own secret recordings, audio files of the restricted channels, the ones that weren't subject to public information requests. She had Lynch, in his own voice, telling Miller to write up a traffic stop of a black teenager as a consensual encounter. She had him bragging about making a group of young men sit on a wet curb for an hour on a cold night because he didn't like their music. When Alana Reed heard those tapes, she knew she had him. She had the pattern from George's notebooks. She had the specific egregious incident from Marcus and Jamal's wires. She had the public video from Maya, the witness. And now she had the cover-up in the supervisor's own voice. "We have enough for a grand jury," Reed announced in their next secret meeting. "We're not just going after Miller and Davis for the diner incident. We're going for a RICO charge, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. We're going to argue that this precinct, under Lynch's command, was operating as a criminal enterprise to violate the civil rights of the citizens it was sworn to protect. It was a bold, audacious strategy. A RICO charge was typically reserved for the mob, not a police precinct. If they failed, the backlash would be enormous, but if they succeeded, they could dismantle the entire corrupt structure." "It's time to bring in the witness," Reed said, looking at Marcus. Marcus and a plain-clothed female detective visited Maya's family that evening. They sat in the living room, the same room where Maya did her homework. Her parents were nervous, protective. They had seen the news, heard the rumors. They were scared of retaliation. "I understand your fear," Marcus told them, his voice calm and reassuring. "But your daughter is a hero. She saw an injustice, and she had the courage to document it. That footage is a crucial piece of evidence that can help make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's child." He explained the federal investigation. He explained that Maya's testimony would be before a grand jury, in secret. Her name would be protected. Maya, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "I want to do it." Her father looked at her, then at Marcus. "You promise you'll protect her?" "With my life," Marcus said. He meant it. The grand jury proceedings were a tightly controlled affair, held in the secure wing of the federal courthouse. Over 3 days, Alana Reed laid out her case with methodical precision. She started with George Patterson. He took the stand, his old notebooks piled on the table in front of him. He spoke for 3 hours, his voice steady, reading entry after entry, painting a devastating portrait of years of systemic abuse. He gave a name and a face to the anonymous statistics. Next came Maria Flores, the dispatcher. Her audio recordings were played in the silent courtroom. Lynch's voice, full of contempt and casual racism, filled the space. The jurors' faces were grim. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a culture. Then came Maya. She was nervous, but when the video from her phone was played on the large screens, her voice became strong as she narrated what she had seen, what she had felt. The video was damning. The raw contempt on Miller's face, the aggressive posture, the public humiliation. It was all there, undeniable. Finally, Marcus and Jamal's wire recordings were played. The audio was crystal clear. The unprovoked order to leave, the sneering, bigoted comments, the false justification for the search, the arrival of Lynch and his immediate, instinctual move to cover for his men. When the recordings finished, the courtroom was silent. Alana Reed let the silence hang in the air for a full minute. "This was not a mistake," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This was not a misunderstanding. This was a system working as intended, a system of intimidation, humiliation, and abuse, protected by a wall of silence and a culture of impunity. We are asking you to do what the police department itself has refused to do. We are asking you to hold these men accountable." The grand jury returned a true bill in less than an hour. Indictments were issued not just for Miller and Davis, but for Sergeant Lynch as well. The charges were extensive: deprivation of civil rights, conspiracy, perjury, and the powerful RICO charge that targeted the entire command structure. The day of the reckoning arrived without warning. It was a Thursday morning, almost a month to the day after the incident at the Bluebird Diner. Marcus and Jamal were not part of the arrest team. That was by design. This was not personal, it was professional. The arrests were carried out by a joint task force of FBI agents and state troopers, officers from outside the city's sphere of influence. They entered the first precinct at 9 a.m. during the morning shift change. They moved with a swift, silent purpose that stunned the precinct's officers into silence. Miller was pulled from roll call. Davis was taken from his desk, where he was processing paperwork. Both men were pale, their faces a mask of disbelief. The main event was Lynch. The agents found him in the evidence locker, the cushy reassignment he thought was a temporary hideout. He was supervising the intake of some minor drug evidence. When the FBI agent in charge, a tall, imposing woman, informed him he was under arrest, he actually laughed. "You're joking, right? This is a prank." "Sergeant Lynch, you're under indictment by a federal grand jury," the agent stated, her voice flat. "Put your hands behind your back." The reality hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. His defiance, the swagger he had shown Marcus in the hallway, was gone. In its place was a pathetic, whimpering fear. "You can't do this," he pleaded. "I'm a sergeant. I have 20 years on the job." "And you'll have plenty of time to reflect on them," the agent said, snapping the handcuffs into place. The click was loud in the sudden silence of the evidence room. They walked him out the same way he and his men had walked countless suspects out of their homes. Through the main squad room, past the desks of the officers he had commanded, the ones he had protected, the ones he had taught to be just like him. No one met his eye. The blue wall had crumbled. It had never been a wall of loyalty. It had been a wall of shared risk, and now that the risk had been individualized, he was on his own. The signature irony was not lost on Marcus, who was watching the events unfold on a live security feed in the federal building. They led Lynch past the same booking desk where he had stood so defiantly a month before. They didn't put him in a cell at the precinct. They put him in the back of a federal vehicle to be transported to the Metropolitan Detention Center. He was no longer their problem. He was a federal defendant. The news broke an hour later. It was the lead story on every channel. The indictments, the arrests, the RICO charge, it was a bombshell that rocked the city. The police commissioner, a man who had publicly defended the department's integrity just a week earlier, was forced to hold a press conference. He looked shaken, blindsided. He announced the immediate, unpaid suspension of the 3 officers and promised full cooperation with the federal investigation. It was too little, too late. By the end of the day, the mayor's office, facing immense public pressure, demanded his resignation. The systemic enabler, the one who had allowed the culture to fester, was finally held accountable. The Department of Justice announced a full pattern and practice investigation into the entire police department, with the threat of a binding consent decree to force systemic reform. The machine wasn't just jammed anymore. It was being taken apart, piece by piece. 3 months later, the winter sun cast a pale, watery light through the windows of the Bluebird Diner. The place was bustling, busier than Marcus had ever seen it. The news of George's role in the investigation had made him a local hero. People came from all over the city to shake his hand, to eat at his diner, to show their support. Marcus sat in the same booth by the window. The vinyl had been repaired. A small, almost invisible patch covered the crack. He ordered his usual: scrambled eggs and rye toast. Jamal sat across from him, a copy of the morning paper folded on the table. The headline read, "Officers Plead Guilty in Civil Rights Case." Miller and Davis, facing overwhelming evidence, had taken a plea deal. They would serve time in a federal prison. Lynch, holding out, was headed to a trial he was certain to lose. "It's a start," Jamal said, tapping the newspaper. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "A start." A young woman came to their table with a pot of coffee. It was Maya. George had given her a part-time job on weekends. She smiled at them, a bright, confident smile that hadn't been there before. "Coffee, detectives?" she asked. "Please, Maya," Marcus said. As she poured, he saw the change in her. The fear was gone. She stood taller. She had seen the system work. She had made it work. George came over and sat with them for a moment. He looked 10 years younger. The weariness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a fierce, quiet pride. "They're setting up a civilian oversight committee," he told them. "First real one this city's ever had. They asked me to be on the board." "Will you do it?" Jamal asked. "I've been keeping records for 15 years, George said with a small smile. "I think I'm qualified for the job." They sat for a while longer, talking, drinking their coffee. The diner was warm, filled with the sounds of conversations and laughter. It felt different. The air was lighter. The shadow that had lingered in the corners was gone. Marcus had 121 days of leave remaining. He had put in his papers the week before. His time was done. He had crossed the finish line. He had kept his promise to his father, to Lena, to himself. He looked out the window at the street. A new police car drove by from a different precinct, a temporary reassignment while the first precinct was being fundamentally restructured. The two officers inside looked young, nervous. They looked at the diner and kept driving. Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet, hard-won peace. It wasn't the giddy feeling of victory. It was something deeper. The satisfaction of a job done right. The knowledge that a small piece of the world was better, fairer than it had been before. He raised his hand, a habit he'd had for years, and touched the face of his watch, feeling the cool, smooth glass under his fingertips. He wasn't counting down anymore. He was just marking the time, the beginning of a new day. Simple. Final. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.